The Night Ledger had spent 19 years turning awkward interviews into national conversations. Politicians had come expecting jokes and discovered spreadsheets. Actors had arrived prepared to promote movies and found themselves explaining statements they had forgotten making. Executives had smiled through monologues until host Mason Vale casually mentioned the one document their communications teams hoped he had never seen. That was the show. Warm enough to make people comfortable, specific enough to make comfort dangerous. But when Prince Adrian Bellmere walked onto the set that Thursday night, he looked completely relaxed. He shook Mason's hand, waved to the audience, sat down beneath the amber studio lights, and smiled like a man who believed he already understood the interview. Adrian had a new memoir, a documentary deal, a charitable foundation, a speaking tour, and a carefully polished message about the life he had built after leaving the Bellmere royal household. For 3 years, he had repeated one sentence more than any other. I chose truth over tradition. It was in the book. It was in interviews. It appeared in the trailer for his documentary. And when Mason brought it up that night, Adrian smiled proudly. I still believe that. Mason smiled back. Good, the audience laughed. Adrian did too. He did not yet understand why Mason had emphasized the word. Good, the interview began exactly as Adrian expected. Mason praised the memoir. You write well. That means a lot. No, seriously, I expected 300 pages of palace curtains and emotional weather. The audience laughed. Adrian grinned. There's a little of that. There's a lot of weather. England, another laugh. Mason leaned back. You say the book is about freedom. Yes, freedom from what? Expectation, that's a big word. It was a big system. You felt trapped? At times. And leaving gave you control of your own story. Adrian nodded. For the first time. Mason's expression softened. That sounds exhausting. It was. Everything seemed safe, almost supportive. Then Mason touched the edge of a thin black folder sitting beside his coffee mug. Adrian noticed. His smile remained, but something in his posture changed. Only slightly. Mason continued. You've said repeatedly that you weren't planning your exit. I wasn't. That it happened after relations inside the palace became impossible. That's correct. And that the decision was emotional rather than strategic. Completely. Mason nodded. Then opened the folder. What Adrian said over the next 25 minutes would matter less than the pattern of how he said it. Because one uncomfortable date became a second contradiction. Then a third. Then a fourth. And by the time Mason removed every document from the conversation and asked Adrian one question with no dates, no palace officials, no anonymous sources, and no disputed timeline, the prince suddenly had nothing left to say. Before we get there, subscribe if you enjoy dramatized stories about what happens when carefully managed public narratives collide with specific questions. Because Mason started with something boring. A corporate registration. Your company is called North Star Meridian. Yes, media, speaking, production, philanthropy. That's the umbrella. You've said you created it after leaving royal duties. I did. Mason slid a page across the desk. This registration is dated 5 months before you left. Adrian looked down. Then back up. There were exploratory discussions. About North Star Meridian? About several possible future structures. Mason nodded. So you were considering a commercial future. Considering isn't planning. Fair, Mason looked at the paper. Who registered the company? Our advisors. On whose instruction? Adrian paused. There were conversations. Mason looked at him. Whose instruction? Adrian inhaled. Mine, ultimately, so you approved it. Yes, 5 months before leaving. Yes, Mason nodded. Okay, Adrian leaned forward. But that doesn't mean the decision had been made. I didn't say it did. It sounds like that's where you're going. I'm still at the registration. The audience laughed. Adrian did not. Mason continued. In your memoir, you say, I stepped outside with no plan except survival. That's emotionally accurate. Mason paused. Emotionally accurate. Yes. What does that mean? It means there's a difference between logistical preparation and emotional certainty. That makes sense. Adrian relaxed slightly. Exactly, Mason smiled. Then why not write that? Adrian's expression tightened. Because memoir isn't a legal deposition, no, it's memory. Sure, and memory is emotional. Mason nodded. So when you write that you had no plan, Adrian interrupted. I had no plan for my life. But you had a registered company. I had a possibility. Mason looked down at the page. Named, registered, structured, and advised. That still doesn't make it a plan. Mason considered this. Okay, he put the page aside. No argument, no sarcasm, no victory. Just another piece placed quietly on the table. Then Mason moved to the second subject. The Viridian Humanitarian Prize. Adrian had received it 8 months earlier for what the award committee described as North Star's rapidly expanding mental health support network for former military personnel. The acceptance speech had been emotional. Adrian had spoken about service, trauma, invisible wounds, responsibility. Mason praised the speech. Adrian thanked him. Then Mason asked, how many counseling centers did North Star operate when you received the award? Adrian paused. We work through partnerships. How many centers? I'd have to check. 3. Adrian nodded. There were also digital services. How many of the 3 were accepting new participants? Adrian looked at Mason. I don't know. 1. That may be right. The award citation said the network had doubled its reach. Our digital reach had expanded. The veteran counseling program had lost funding 2 months earlier. Temporarily, and 2 locations had suspended intake. For restructuring. Mason nodded. So what doubled? Adrian shifted. Awareness? People engaging with the initiative. Online? Yes, Mason looked at his notes. Social media? In part. The audience murmured. Adrian frowned. This is the danger of reducing charitable work to metrics. Mason looked up. I didn't reduce it. You're talking about numbers. The award talked about numbers. That isn't what I mean. What do you mean? Adrian leaned back. I mean, impact isn't always visible in a spreadsheet. I agree. Good, Mason nodded. But if the award says the program expanded, and the program became smaller, that seems like something worth asking about. The mission expanded, not the program. The mission and program are connected. They're not synonyms. Adrian's jaw tightened. I think we're getting lost in wording. Mason smiled faintly. You wrote a memoir. The audience laughed. Adrian stared at him. Mason waited for the room to settle. Wording is kind of the product. Another laugh. This time Adrian looked toward the audience. Mason moved on. Let's talk about Bellhaven. That changed Adrian's face. Bellhaven was an island retreat frequently mentioned in his memoir. According to Adrian, it was where he made the final decision to leave royal life. The book described him boarding a private flight after what he called a brutal week inside the palace. He wrote that the trip was spontaneous, unplanned, an escape. Somewhere over the Atlantic, he claimed, he realized he could not return to his previous life. It was perhaps the most famous passage in the entire book. Mason quoted none of it. He asked, when was the Bellhaven trip booked? Adrian hesitated. I don't remember. Roughly, a few days beforehand. Mason opened another page. You were announced as keynote guest at the Bellhaven Leadership Summit 24 days before departure. Adrian stared at him. The summit wasn't the reason I went. Didn't ask that. You're implying the trip was planned. The flight was. Parts of the trip were planned. The hotel? Yes. The summit? Yes. Security? Obviously. The aircraft? Adrian sighed. Yes, Mason nodded. Then what was spontaneous? The decision to use the trip as space to think. Mason paused. That sounds completely reasonable. It is. I believe you. Adrian looked surprised. Mason continued. But in the book, the palace crisis causes the trip. Adrian's expression hardened. It caused the emotional urgency. The trip was already happening. You're being literal. I'm asking about chronology. Real life doesn't happen in chronology. Mason paused. The audience laughed before he even answered. Mason looked at them. Actually, the laughter grew. Adrian's face tightened. Mason lifted one hand. No, the room settled. He looked back at Adrian. I understand what you mean. Life is messy. Exactly. Stories are cleaner. Yes, is that what happened? Adrian paused. What? Did you clean the story up? Adrian stared at him. No. You made the travel sound caused by the crisis because it made the sequence more powerful. No. Then why is the order different? There is no different order. The trip existed before the event you say caused it. Adrian leaned forward. This is becoming deliberately pedantic. Mason nodded. Maybe he closed the page. But the date still exists. Silence. Then Mason changed direction again. Staff, North Star Meridian had launched with enormous attention. Adrian publicly promised a different workplace culture from the rigid institution he had left behind. He described the company as collaborative, open, compassionate. He said hierarchy had damaged too many organizations and North Star would operate differently. Mason quoted Adrian's own words, "People flourish when leadership listens." I believe that. How many senior employees has North Star had in 3 years? Adrian looked cautious now. I don't know. 21. That sounds possible. How many of the original senior team remain? Adrian paused. Several, 4. Adrian looked at Mason. Startups experience turnover. They do, especially high-profile ones. Absolutely, people discover the role isn't right. Sure, Adrian seemed to relax. Mason asked, why did 17 senior people leave? Adrian's expression closed. I can't discuss confidential employment matters. I'm not asking for names. Those situations involve people's privacy. Okay. Mason looked at his notes. 4 communications directors. Adrian said nothing. 3 chiefs of staff. Silence. 2 finance directors. Adrian crossed his arms. You're compiling unrelated departures. Mason looked up. Compiling, yes. That's a good word. Adrian frowned. Mason continued. If I chose random people across unrelated companies and pretended they formed a pattern, that would be misleading. Which is essentially what you're doing. They all worked for you. They worked for North Star. You founded North Star. I don't manage every employee. They were senior leadership. Adrian exhaled. What are you suggesting? Nothing yet. You clearly are. I'm asking why they left. I told you. Different reasons. Give me one. I'm not discussing individuals. Don't. Adrian stared at him. Describe one disagreement without identifying anybody. Silence. 1. Adrian shifted. There were differences around strategic alignment. Mason repeated it slowly. Strategic alignment. Yes, what did you disagree about? Direction. What direction? Operational direction. Mason paused. Operational direction. Yes, that sounds like language designed to survive a press release. The audience laughed. Adrian's face hardened. I'm trying to respect people's confidentiality, and I'm trying to understand the phrase. It means not everyone agreed about how the organization should develop. Mason nodded. That's much clearer. Adrian said nothing. What did you want? Excuse me? What direction did you want? Adrian paused. Growth with integrity. What did they want? Silence. Mason waited. Adrian looked down. Different things. One example. Adrian shook his head. I'm not going to participate in turning former employees into entertainment. Mason leaned back. I haven't mentioned one name. You don't need to. Then tell me what you learned. Adrian looked at him. From what? 17 senior departures. Adrian hesitated. That leadership is difficult. For you? For everyone. What did you change? Silence. Mason waited. Adrian's eyes moved toward the stage manager, then back. What did you change about your own leadership? Adrian's mouth tightened. We constantly evolve. Example? Adrian's voice sharpened. I think you've made your point. Mason shook his head. I'm still trying to find yours. The audience reacted. Adrian looked toward them again. This time, his frustration was obvious. Mason closed the fourth page. Last subject. Adrian's expression changed. The fifth subject was family. For years, Adrian had spoken publicly about wanting reconciliation with his older brother, Crown Prince Lucian. He said he loved him, missed him, wanted peace. But Adrian's memoir also contained private conversations between them. Arguments, accusations, moments Lucian had never publicly discussed. During promotion for the book, Adrian had insisted that revealing those conversations was necessary because silence protected unhealthy systems. Mason began with one simple question. Do you speak to your brother? Adrian's expression went still. I'm not going to discuss current private communication. Mason nodded. Fair. Adrian seemed surprised. Mason continued. Did he consent to the conversations in your memoir being published? No, why was that different? Adrian paused. That was my story. He was in it. My experience belonged to me. His words? Adrian's jaw tightened. They were part of my experience. Mason nodded. So privacy depends on who is telling the story? No. What does it depend on? Purpose, whose purpose? Adrian stared. Mason continued. When revealing private conversations helped explain your departure, you believed disclosure was justified. Yes, now that questions might reveal something uncomfortable about the current relationship, privacy becomes absolute. That's an unfair comparison. Why? Because I'm not discussing my brother on a comedy show. You discussed him in a commercial memoir. Adrian leaned forward, which was serious work. The audience reacted. Mason's eyebrows rose. Adrian realized how the sentence sounded. There was a flicker, a moment when he could have softened it. Instead, he continued. This kind of questioning is exactly why people lose faith in media. Mason nodded. That may be true. You take complicated relationships and turn them into traps. How? By stripping away context. There it was again. Mason looked at the pages on the desk. The company registration needs context. Yes, the award needs context. Yes, Bellhaven needs context. Yes, the staff departures need context. Obviously, your brother needs context. Yes, Mason nodded. Then closed the folder. No more documents. Adrian watched him. No dates. Silence. No employees. Adrian's shoulders stayed rigid. No palace. Mason folded his hands. One question. Adrian waited. What would you accept responsibility for? Adrian blinked. What? In this entire story? Adrian stared. Mason continued. If the company timeline is misunderstood, the wording is the problem. Silence. If the award exaggerates, the committee wrote it. Adrian shifted. If the travel story doesn't match the dates, memoir is emotional. No answer. If 17 senior people leave, leadership is difficult. Adrian's jaw tightened. If private conversations are published, they are your experience. Mason leaned forward. What part belongs to you? Adrian opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The silence lasted. 3 seconds. 5, 7. Mason did not move. Adrian looked toward the audience. Nobody laughed. Mason spoke quietly. You've spent 3 years explaining what everybody else should acknowledge. Adrian's face hardened. The palace. Silence your advisors. Another pause. The press. Mason continued. Your brother. Adrian looked away. What should you acknowledge? Adrian finally answered. I have acknowledged plenty. Name one. Silence again. Mason waited. Adrian shook his head. This is hostile. Mason's expression barely changed. No. He gestured toward the closed folder. This has been specific. The room went completely quiet. Adrian stared at him. You invited me here pretending this was going to be a conversation. It is. This is prosecution. You wrote a book making claims about an institution, your family, and your own decisions. That doesn't mean I surrender the right to boundaries. You don't. Then respect them. I do. Mason paused. You can refuse every question. Adrian stared. You can leave right now. Another silence. But refusing a question and disproving its premise are different things. Adrian stood. A gasp moved through the audience. Mason remained seated. There, Adrian reached for his microphone. That's exactly the kind of arrogance I'm talking about. Mason said nothing. Adrian removed the microphone. I chose truth over tradition because the institution never allowed honest conversations. Mason looked up. And then the phrase returned. Once. Only once. You chose truth over tradition. Adrian froze. Mason continued. I'm asking whether truth still counts when it points back at you. The audience fell completely silent. Adrian stared at Mason. No answer. Then he placed the microphone on the desk. I'm done. Mason nodded. That's your decision. Adrian walked toward the curtain. Nobody stopped him. Nobody booed. Nobody applauded. Mason watched him leave, then looked toward the audience. Don't cheer. They remained silent. He's allowed to leave. Mason glanced at the empty chair. That isn't the problem. A few moments later, political satirist Dana Crew, a regular contributor to the Night Ledger, joined Mason at the desk. She looked toward the empty chair. That was rough. Mason exhaled. Yes, Dana turned toward the camera. But I want to explain something. She pointed at the closed folder. None of those documents proved Prince Adrian is dishonest. Mason nodded. Correct. They proved something narrower. Dana continued. Every time the public story met a specific contradiction, the explanation changed category. The registration became exploration. The award became mission. The planned trip became emotional spontaneity. The staff turnover became alignment. The private disclosures became personal experience. She looked at Mason. Individually, each explanation is possible. Yes, together they create the question. Mason nodded. What part does he own? Exactly, by morning the clips spreading fastest were not of Adrian walking away. They were shorter, quieter. Then why not write that? Wording is kind of the product. The date still exists. Give me one. What did you change about your own leadership? This has been specific. And finally, what part belongs to you? North Star Meridian issued a statement before noon. It described the interview as a bad faith exercise built around selective framing and a refusal to recognize the complexity of personal memory. The following evening, Mason addressed it. No dramatic montage, no image of Adrian walking off stage, just the statement on his desk. They say we refuse to recognize complexity. Mason looked into the camera. I like complexity. He held up the first page. A company can be registered before somebody emotionally decides to leave. The second, an award can be meaningful even if its citation exaggerates. The third, a planned trip can become emotionally transformative. The fourth, staff can leave good organizations. Then he placed the pages down. All of those things can be true. The audience was silent. And if that had been the answer, we probably would have had a very boring interview. A few people laughed. Mason did not. But complexity is not the same thing as immunity. He paused. If every contradiction is explained by saying reality is complicated, eventually the explanation stops explaining anything. Another pause. And if accountability only applies to institutions, families, journalists, employees, and critics, Mason looked directly into the camera. Then it isn't accountability. Silence. It's branding. The audience erupted. Mason raised a hand. Don't celebrate the walkout. The room settled. A man left an interview. He shrugged. That happens. Then he tapped the closed folder once. The interesting part happened before he stood up. Mason leaned back. He ran out of answers while he was still sitting down. If you want more dramatized stories about the moment specificity reveals what polished language cannot, subscribe, drop a like. Share this with someone who understands that difficult questions are not automatically hostile questions. More precision. More accountability. More moments when the silence after one simple question says more than an entire publicity tour. Stay with us.